Hey guys, Peter Franson here from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Let's talk about Junkyard, Juggernauts, an upcoming 1 to 4 player, mostly co-op indie tabletop game about a hybrid fantasy sci-fi world in which you, the children of missing royalty, seek to free the land from an evil warlord by building robotic juggernauts to take on the warlord's servants and eventually the warlord himself. The game includes a betrayal mechanic that can cause players to side with the warlord, although this mechanic is not used in the solo version of the game, which is the only play mode I familiarized myself with. I should say from the start that the developer, Francisco Ruiz, is an online friend and a longtime supporter of my work, so feel free to take that into consideration. However, my aim here is not to give you my opinion on the game, but to try and give you an idea of what kind of game it is, so you can decide for yourself if it's something you want to check out more, if it's something that you might enjoy. The game starts by setting up the play area and selecting your character. Each has an elemental affinity, which mainly gives a boost to your Juggernaut if you build it with that affinity in mind. After character selection, you draft cards from the junk pile of cards, which represents the junkyard you start out in as you are in hiding from the warlord. From the cards you draw, 4 are selected as your starting arms and legs for your Juggernaut, and their stats determine your speed, which affects turn order, and your strength, which affects damage in combat. Remaining cards are kept in your hand and can be used later to tactically enhance your Juggernaut in combat. After building your Juggernaut, you start exploring along pathways and trails of the overworld map, which is the main game board. Now, each turn, in addition to moving from one location to another, you'll have the opportunity to take one of several core actions. The first is to complete a quest. As you play, you'll be able to pick up simple side quests that yield rewards that can enhance your Juggernaut or give various one-time bonuses. The second action is you can augment your Juggernaut, which is taking a break from other actions for the sake of improving your Juggernaut. Third, and this one has some branching options, that's meet the locals. This means taking part in whatever unique activity is available at your current location on the board. At brigand camps, you can gamble for potential reward or disband the camp at the cost of some damage to your Juggernaut. At cities, you can fight a junk golem to free the city if it's enslaved, or if it's already free, you can take advantage of city services to restore or rework your Juggernaut. At villages, you can augment your Juggernaut with the advantage of getting help from the locals, seemingly coercing them, from what I can tell, based on the after effects of there being some corruption spread, and I'll come back to that mechanic in a second. And then the fourth major action you can take is to patrol an area to help the locals, fighting off any robotic beasts you run into, and also finding loot as you do that. Okay, so let's talk about that corruption mechanic. As you travel and explore, certain actions and events will cause corruption to spread. By default, some corruption always spreads each round, but choices you make that are less than selfless, such as taking a break from saving the land so you can upgrade your Juggernaut, or choosing not to fulfill the more selfless path option of a quest, these things will cause your character to take on corruption. You're also incentivized to take on corruption by collecting corruption tokens that appear on the board, since corruption left on the board will be gathered and used by the Overlord in the final boss fight to make defeating him more difficult. And you can also use certain locations to turn corruption you've gathered into different resources that will help you in your quest. Often along the way, as you might imagine, exploring the overworld map, you're going to enter combat with robotic enemies of various sizes and strength, built out of the same cards you use to build and upgrade your Juggernaut throughout the game. These range from smaller beasts to the mid-sized junk golems, and eventually the massive and intimidating Warmok final boss of the game. In combat, you are basically trying to defeat the enemy by reducing their limb stats to 0. Combat doesn't involve much dice rolling. It's mostly about carefully considering your options, including the stats of your Juggernaut, options uniquely built into the character you chose, and cards or other unique advantages available to you that you may have found in your adventure. There seem to really be a lot of potential options to choose from each turn in combat, so it's fairly tactical rather than being a dice-chucking, luck-dependent game, even though there are some dice rolls now and then. I would highly recommend, if you're interested, that you check out the How to Play videos on the Firejoy Studios website at firejoystudios.com. You can get a much more in-depth explanation of combat and the rest of gameplay without maybe some errors that I have inadvertently included in my description of it. Now, if you lose a combat scenario before the final boss fight, the game doesn't end, but you are significantly set back, keeping some of what you've gained, but also having to rebuild a new Juggernaut for yourself at the Junkyard before heading out to continue adventuring again. And of course, if you lose the final battle, you lose the game. So you want to prep for that as much as you can. To that end, as you defeat enemies, complete quests, disband brigand camps, you gain heroic feats, which are a sort of leveling up system giving you new specializations in combat, which are all the stronger if you select them according to your character's innate element. And to access all the potential specializations you can unlock, you'll need to customize your Juggernaut to meet required specs, giving you incentive to always be tinkering and looking for that next way to upgrade your Juggernaut. Now, although the presentation of the game uses a retro pixel graphic style with a somewhat light and even playful tone, it would be a mistake, if you couldn't tell already, to assume this is a simplistic game that families with young children will be able to easily play together. There is a lot of depth and crunchiness to the rules of this game. In addition to what I've already mentioned, there's a good amount of iconography you'll need to become familiar with, as it's used throughout the rulebook and components as a shorthand for the concepts being referred to. There are also multiple tables and rules descriptions for a diverse number of situations in the game. So my guess is that those learning the game may feel pretty challenged unless they are used to playing a variety of board games with meaty rules, and will likely still be referring to the rulebook frequently after learning to play. A trade-off is what seems to be some nice replay value with alternate rules you can try out and 5 different story endings the game can have. So that's a very basic overview of Junkyard Juggernauts. Visit firejoystudios.com for much more. But speaking of the game's story, as always, I like to keep an eye out for any thematic or conceptual parallels to real-world spiritual, moral, or philosophical ideas, and then comment on those from a biblical Christian perspective. And in this case, I know that the developer is a Christian and told me he was curious what I might have to say in this regard. First off, I think this is a game you can play in a mixed group of Christians and non-Christians and not have any complaints that it's being preachy or cheesy in its incorporation of Christian ideas. In fact, they are pretty subtle and more like a potential springboard for those who actively want to use the game to reflect on some spiritual truths. For most, I suspect they will go unnoticed. The more obvious allusions to Christian concepts are in terminology. Words like acolyte, psalm, or hymn certainly evoke a sense of the religious, though not overtly Christian. There's even a mechanism called sacrificial atonement, in which one player can rescue another player who's become corrupted and turned into a servant of the warlord. But the parallel that stood out to me, intended or not, I can't say, is that of the core premise of the game's story and the identity of the player characters. They are royalty, and they are endeavoring to act on behalf of the king and kingdom, although the king is currently nowhere to be seen. And the kingdom is hard to see amidst this world of ruin and enslavement to evil. In fact, these royal heirs of the kingdom who are trying to serve the kingdom and free the people enslaved by evil have to deal with the fact that the people initially distrust them and don't recognize them as royalty. It may even be the case that they choose to be selfish in their choices and gain enough corruption to actually become a tool used by the ultimate evil enemy in the game. And on top of all these challenges, they also have to make do with what they can put together in a junkyard, a far cry from the beautiful kingdom they are a part of. As believers in Jesus, we have been adopted into God's family, making us royal children of the highest of all kings. But that identity is unrecognized by the world we hope to bring truth and freedom to, and in fact, we are often distrusted at best. And sometimes we can earn that distrust by giving in to selfishness and becoming an unwitting tool of our true spiritual enemy. And yet, our calling is to make the best of the limitations we have in the broken world we live in, to help others discover the freedom they can have, the adoption they can experience through Jesus, that we are hopefully growing in experiencing ourselves more and more. Of course, a key difference is that we are not the ones who have to defeat ultimate evil. We actually can't, but Jesus has won that victory for us, and we live and rest in that victory as we wait for its complete fulfillment. But in the meantime, we certainly have battles to fight that can be won or lost as we endeavor to live in the identity God has given us and pursue service to God and His coming kingdom, a kingdom that in some ways is already secretly here. All right, well, I want to thank the developer for loaning me a copy for this overview of Junkyard Juggernauts. You can get more info about Junkyard Juggernauts, including news about its upcoming Kickstarter, by going to firejoystudios.com. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.